Deputy Catherine Connolly, please.
I hope it's last but not least at this time of the evening, but it's a huge privilege to have this time really to tease out some of the issues involved in this piece of legislation. I wished I had that time earlier for COVID, but I certainly welcome for this very important topic. This is a huge piece of legislation, and I want to thank the Minister that's here and the Senior Minister and the members and the staff of the department. A huge amount of work went into this, and I want to acknowledge that. And there are 124 pages, 128 sections, 18 parts and 4 schedules, or 4 schedules, whichever way we pronounce it. And I'm going to come to the purpose of it and maybe a broader discussion of what education is about and academic freedom and where we're going and where that debate should really take place. It's been pointed out that we're changing a piece of legislation that's 51 years old. And we talk about transformative action, and earlier on today, Deputy Richard Boyd-Barrett, I think he quoted from Ulysses, which probably is the first time Ulysses was quoted in the Dáil, but maybe I'm wrong, and James Joyce. And I want to comment, I want to use that in a different sense. When I heard various comments on Ulysses, they talked about the transformative effect of Ulysses on literature. And I would like to think that we've come to the point where third level will have a transformative effect on our society, because really we have no choice about that. After COVID and with climate change, we have no choice but to seek to have our third level institutions produce a transformative effect, otherwise we're finished. And Deputy Jim O'Callaghan, when you come as the last speaker, you're able to pick up different things and comment on different things, which is both fair and unfair. But that's the reward for waiting till the end. And Deputy Jim O'Callaghan talked about the huge role that universities have had, and they've had. But they've also had a huge role in promoting inequality. They've also had a huge role in backing up an establishment that saw ongoing consumption as the model of behaviour, which has led to tremendous problems, not least of which is the existential crisis facing us with climate change. So this is the time, really, I think, if this is the beginning of a discussion, then I welcome it. It's certainly not the end of a discussion for me. And so we have what we've been told, and we've all read the explanatory memorandum and the purposes of the bill. It's to reform the legislative framework for higher education system, enabling improved oversight and regulation, and giving a legal basis to the powers that the Údaráis were using up to now. But now they're underpinned by statute, and presumably they're extended a little bit. Now, we have to ask, why do we need this legislation before we get on to the bigger topic in relation to what is third level education supposed to be doing? And we need it because governance has utterly failed. And I had the privilege of going to university. I've also had the privilege of coming from a large family, which was the biggest education I ever got, and the range of experience and jobs and occupations extends from medical doctors to teachers to plumbers, carpenters, plasterers. And that's the privilege of coming from a bigger family. And within that, you have always people to bring you up and bring you down. And when you're down, they'll bring you up. And when you're up too far, they'll bring you down very quickly. And I have always had a huge problem with the inbuilt snobbery in Irish society, where third level was put up there, certainly the universities, to the detriment of society, not just to the detriment of our skilled people and the need for skilled people. And we see it in the construction industry and a whole range. But that was built into the system. And I welcome that theoretically that's changing. And I've heard the Minister and both Ministers make very positive comments, and the National Apprenticeship Office that has been set up. And I welcome that if we're beginning to rebalance. But we're looking at governance. And so my real university education was on the Public Accounts Committee. And I have always publicly paid tribute to the staff in particular and to the I've forgotten his name, the Controller and Auditor General, and they certainly are excellent public servants. And it was on that committee that I began to get a real university education when I saw what was coming before me. And I have to say my biggest disappointment at the time were the 7 male leaders of the 7 universities who, I have said it, educated, I put it in inverted commas, a complete inability to reflect or to openly discuss where universities had gone into a cul-de-sac in terms of public space being used for the development of companies for private gain, one issue. The role of foundations, unaccounted, they're my words, particularly we'll say in Galway, with a sizable and a substantial amount of money in the accounts of that foundation. And on that foundation in New York and in Galway, in Ireland, we had boards managing it, everyone from Goldman Sachs to Coca-Cola. This was all new for me to learn, that foundations described by the university as benign, given such an important role in the development of our building in Galway, which may be good or bad if it's done good in an open and accountable way, not so good if it's not. And so more and more buildings being put up for particular subjects as opposed to other subjects, and no student accommodation and so on. So I mentioned Galway. The issues there were precarity of employment, precariousness, which is repeated in all universities, of course dominated by females, that precariousness. We had the very brave Sheehy Skeffington taking a case, and then the new president sorting out the cases, the legacy cases that were there. And we were learning all of the time in my own city, which I was partly aware of and partly unaware of, what university was life like for lots of the staff who had no tenure. And the more untenured the position, if I put it like that, the more it was dominated by females. And then we had the role of whistleblowers coming before us from Limerick and other places, enlightening us in a very painful way as to the failure and repeated failure of governance on the ground in all of these universities. So that's why we're here tonight. And if we look at Dr. Yvonne Ní Thuilleabháin, and I know not to mention names, but this is all public, assistant professor, lots of professors have been mentioned tonight, assistant professor in School of Mathematics and Statistics, UCD, in fact, the last university to admit a woman. I think Galway was one of the first, and we have Alice Perry, engineer, first woman to qualify as an engineer in Europe going back. So Galway was slightly better. UCD distinguished itself by being the last university to let women go in. And so right back into up to the 21st century, we have Dr. Yvonne Ní Thuilleabháin very courageously reporting repeated sexual harassment over 2 years, from May 15 to July 17, by a professor, he's been named publicly, Hans Benjamin Brown. He was convicted of harassment, and this a barring order again issued from contacting the assistant professor for 5 years. Now again, I'm taking this because this has all been publicly reported, and she repeatedly reported the instance to a UCD Human Resources Department, being advised to report it to the Gardaí. The harassment lasted for 2 years from her first bringing it to the attention of the university, and then she makes a formal complaint, and then she's dissuaded really from not doing that, and on it goes. And finally, Minister Harris, after Dr. Ní Thuilleabháin went public with her experience, requested from each higher education institute action plans against sexual violence and harassment. Now, that's just one example. The research that's been quoted here tonight shows how difficult it is in each university in terms of the experience of women and men sometimes in relation to violence. So that's the background that we're bringing in this legislation here tonight. I welcome it in that sense. It needs a lot more discussion and certainly amendments. Is cúis mór dímádorm go bhfuil nach bhfuil ach píosa beag amháin ó thaobh na Gaelgaide. Píosa beag amháin ag Carranúil go bhfuil an rialtas nó go bhfuil an Údaráis taobh hir de Gaelga. There's the tiniest little bit in relation to the Irish language, which is a huge disappointment to me. And I really would like this teased out further, Minister, if it's possible, because in that huge piece of legislation, that you have 124 pages, I think we have two lines on the Irish language. I've just missed it at the moment, but it's there, 2 lines in relation to promoting under one of the objects, which is a funny word, objects, as opposed to objectives or purposes or aims. The word object is used, and under that, amidst something else, we're going to promote the Irish language. That's a serious worry to me. I welcome the commitment to lifelong learning. I think it's the answer. Again, it's how we measure that and how we ensure that there's open access. Some of my colleagues here on the left have often talked about opening up third level education, and I must say I agree with them. It's something that should be explored and practical research done to see what would be the implications of opening up third level to everyone, regardless of the points they have in their Leave Insert. Rather than it being dismissed or sneered at, I think that it's very important that it be looked at and research done on it. I understand it's happened in other countries. Now, if we go back to what university is all about, and I looked at various people, and you know, I'm going to start with the President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins, who gave a very interesting speech in June, the 8th of June, and it was on academic freedom. And significantly, it was an address at the Scholars at Risk. The Scholars at Risk Ireland, all European academies, I can't pronounce it this time, I've got so tired, conference. So Scholars at Risk is the important thing. And amongst other issues, he looks at the danger posed to universities without academic freedom. And what does academic freedom actually mean? And it's certainly not synonymous with autonomy of the university. The university can have autonomy, but that doesn't mean it has academic freedom. I don't have the time to go into it. I couldn't do it like Michael D has done, but he has done it here and raised very significant issues in relation to the purposes of our universities and what are they for and who are they serving and what are the dangers. Equally, Dr. Kathleen Lynch in UCD with her colleagues and another colleague from Galway, Geraldine Simi, all have raised questions in relation to the commercialisation of our educational system, the marketisation of it, and the aligning which we have done with government policy that was produced in 2011 during times of austerity when the strategic policy was produced for the third level education, and the absolute alignment of industry with university. Now, I have a huge difficulty with that. I want Ireland to thrive. I want our economy to thrive. And I certainly want Galway City to lead the way as a green, thriving city. But it must be sustainable. And so we are facing a biodiversity emergency, a climate change emergency, and COVID. And we've had all those empty words that there's no going back. We can't go back to where we were. We must change and we must learn. And yet, we have speaker after speaker praising the identification and the alignment of industry with third level education, praising a campus that's putting industry and university as one, as the trinity. Public funds, developer and university as a trinity. I seriously question that model. And I can think of no better way to highlight why we need universities to question than to look at the Nyberg report in relation to misjudging risk, the Nyberg report into the banking, causes of the systemic banking crisis in Ireland, report of the Commission of Investigation into the banking sector in Ireland, published 2011. It was commissioned to provide answers on why a number of institutions, private and public, acted in an imprudent manner. I can think of a lot of other adjectives there now than imprudent, but they're an imprudent manner, thereby continuing to the occurrence of the Irish banking crisis. And what did they find? Herding, groupthink, consensus, silent observers, enablers. They were all the key words in the report that allowed the banking crisis to happen without any question. The Commission considers that this pervasive pressure, pervasive pressure for consensus may explain why so many different parties in Ireland simultaneously were willing to adopt specific policies and accepted practices that later proved unsound. Widespread lack of critical discussion within many banks and authorities indicates a tendency to groupthink. Serious consideration, something as basic as this, serious consideration of alternatives appear to be modest or absent. I could go on, but I'm going to pick from a different speaker, and this is the Vice-Chancellor of Oxford University, who, in commemoration of the 1916, there was a series of talks in Galway and Ard-Oideachas, and they've been published in book form. And Louise Richardson, her Vice-Chancellor of Oxford University, an Irish woman, the role of education in addressing the challenges of the 21st century in Ireland, 1916 to 2016, the promise and the challenge of national sovereignty. And she said, if universities focus exclusively on training a skilled workforce, we lose the opportunity to provide an education that is so much broader and more important. An education that produces a generation accustomed to thinking critically, acting ethically, and always questioning. Whether it is the doctrines of the government of the day or the ideologies of those who wish to overthrow it, will ensure a generation that will question those proponents of violence. And she goes on to say, an education that teaches empathy with others, that exposes its students to a cosmopolitan community of scholars, that delights in difference rather than fears it, and that inculcates the belief that truth is an aspiration, not a possession, will produce a generation that will reject any effort to impose orthodoxy. And finally, what she said, if we want to master new technologies, master them, not be mastered by the technologies, we must educate not only those with the ability to make scientific discoveries and technological innovations, we must educate a generation with the moral sensitivity to think through the ethical implications of these discoveries and the innovation for the rest of society. Now, I don't have answers here, Minister, but I do think if we were to commit to the start of an open discussion and a debate as to the purpose of third-level institutions and how we have produced so many graduates that have an inability to think critically or that have lacked the courage to stand up and say that is wrong. What is happening in this university is wrong. And how we have allowed governance practices and procedures to stay in place that add to the abuse suffered by various people raises the most serious questions as to what we're doing in our third-level institutions. And I'm a graduate of a third-level institution. And I go back to Galway and the governing body in Galway when the procedures or the law, the internal legislation was changed in relation to legislation, and that a large governing body, and the big thing was to get governance, not critical thinking, consensus in relation to doing away with the requirement for Irish, the details of which I forget at this point. But the important issue is consensus was important, as opposed to cherishing critical debate and analysis of a subject, and perhaps having agreed to differ in relation to these issues. So while I welcome all of the work that's gone into this, I share the concerns and the issues that have been laid out by people far more educated and articulate than I, including the President of Ireland, including Professor Kathleen Lynch, who has gallantly struggled on with her colleagues for years, highlighting all of these issues, but also equally highlighting the alternatives that could be in place with collaborative research, with research for research's sake, which seems to have died a death in universities because the research has to have a specific purpose. And I'll finish in relation to vaccinations and that. And many, many times we have praised the pharmaceutical companies here. The pharmaceutical companies have produced vaccines at an obscene profit with public funds and no risk. The risk was taken away completely from them, and we carried that risk on public money. So when we're praising research, let's analyse the purpose of that research, who's behind that research, and who's paying for it. And when that research has been done, what research has not been done. For example, in Galway, I think of a struggling PhD student trying to get money to look at an ecological corridor and red squirrels a part of that thing, struggling to get money, to get recognition from university in relation to an ecological corridor, which you imagine a university would champion as being absolutely what we need to be doing as one aspect of our biodiversity and climate crisis.